Hi guys, and welcome back to the Early Bird Photo News. I've only just come back from the Outback recently, but when a friend asked me last week if I wanted to come up to the mountains with him to photograph some pretty awesome and rare birds, I couldn't say no, of course. So I spent the last few days chasing awesome looking regent bowerbirds and the pretty rare and difficult to get paradise riflebird. The conditions were pretty challenging because first of all, you need to find the birds. But even if you find the birds and they come to your perch, they are still incredibly hard to photograph because they have this really dark black plumage. And most of the time you actually end up with an almost completely black looking bird. So you have to have the perfect light and the perfect angle on the bird to see the iridescence in the throat, on the head, and some nice details in the feathers. And then you might think the regent bowerbird is easier, but it also has this dark plumage where you need to kind of overexpose. But then at the same time, it has these really bright yellow wing and neck feathers that you need to kind of underexpose for to not blow them out completely. So now it would have been nice, of course, to have some clouds, but we didn't basically get any clouds and had to shoot in full sunlight. So we basically focused on the early morning hours and the late afternoon where the sun was still kind of hidden behind the mountain, shining through the trees, so we didn't have the full sunlight on the bird. To balance out the details in the feathers and get a bit of a better exposure, I started to use flash again. But that reminded me why I basically haven't used flash with mirrorless cameras over the last little while, because it's pretty annoying, especially if you're using an R5, because then the camera becomes quite limited. First of all, you don't have the exposure simulation in the viewfinder anymore, and it's much harder to judge your exposure. So I wish Canon would allow me to still have the exposure simulation if I'm using flash just as a fill flash. And then secondly, you don't have the ability to use the electronic shutter on the R5 when you're using flash. So you have to use the mechanical shutter or the first curtain electronic shutter. So you have to have a slower frame rate and you have the shutter sound. And then also, the flash is not able to usually keep up with the high shutter speeds that you're using because you're shooting in high sync mode. So the flash has to recycle quite quickly and it's not able to flash every single frame that you're taking. So you end up with a lot of non-flashed shots and have to use a slower frame rate for the flash to even have any sort of chance to keep up. With Canon, I think it's only the R3 that allows you to use the electronic shutter mode with the flash. So even with using the flash and doing perfect exposures in the field, it's still going to be hard to edit these photos because the birds are so dark. I had to use high ISO, so I have to denoise the files. So it's definitely going to be a challenge, but I'm sure with a few tweaks here and there that I show you in my masterclass and a few curve layers, I will be able to get some good results that I will share with you in another video. And if you guys want to learn how to edit these tricky images, get the most out of your photos and get the best results, I would highly recommend that you check out my PROSETS and masterclass down there in the description. With my PROSETS, I allow you with just one click to get a great starting point and great colors in your RAW file. And in my masterclass, I teach you step by step all the tools you need to know in Photoshop to get the best results and make your own images look amazing. So if that's of interest to you, make sure to check these out down there in the description. Last week I said that I have been using the Photoshop beta version to take advantage of the new AI tools like the generative fill and the new remove tool. And just after I've basically finished the video, Photoshop released these features into the full version of Photoshop. So if you're going to your Adobe app and download the latest Photoshop version 2024, you'll now have the generative AI fill and the new remove tool as part of the normal Photoshop, which is pretty exciting, even though there still seem to be some limitations. When I was using the generative AI fill, even in the latest version of Photoshop, it still seems to only work properly if you're using a size to fill in that is smaller than like 1300 pixels. If you try to fill in like a large portion of your frame, for instance, it will look a bit more sort of smudgy and doesn't have the same noise levels as your photo, for instance. So there's still some limitations that I hope will be lifted in the future, but for now it's exciting to see some of these AI tools coming to the normal Photoshop because they can be quite helpful in your workflow, even though there's still some limitations at the moment. Talking about image editing, I've also edited a few more photos for my recent road trip, and there was one special moment that I will probably never forget. We're driving through the Outback, there's no water, no birds, just kind of rocky, endless gibber plains, no trees. It just looks dry and hot and dusty. And suddenly there's a bridge and we're crossing this channel and the channel is full of water and there's literally millions of birds in this channel. There's lots of pelicans in the middle of nowhere, 2,000 kilometers away from the coast, lots of kites, lots of ducks, lots of egrets and herons, and it was just a complete crazy frenzy. How crazy is that all these birds suddenly know it rains in the Outback and then travel to these channels in the middle of nowhere. There was another bird I was really hoping to get, and that's the inland dotterel. It's a little shorebird that lives in the middle of the outback. One morning we were driving along a road and saw first a small flock, but none of them hung around. They just saw us and walked straight away from us without ever turning around, so we couldn't get any photos. But then after a little while we came across another group of birds, so quickly got out of the car, low to the ground. I was using the 600mm lens with a 2x extender on my f5, and most birds casually walked away from us. But one bird perched on a little hill for just a brief moment, and when I looked through my viewfinder I realized it also had two little babies with them. I got a few shots before that family also walked off, and of course I didn't want to chase them, so I got back into the car, drove off so they could continue their day in peace. How cute are those babies, eh? Canon has filed some very interesting and innovative patent applications this week that are sort of centering around bringing better video features to the EOS R style camera, something that I would really appreciate. The first one is a potentially sort of cooling battery grip that you could attach to a camera, and that would help it to stop it from overheating. So the grip might have a little sort of fan in it that hopefully wouldn't be too noisy or have too many vibrations, but would help to actually keep the camera cool and not overheat. And that's definitely something we would appreciate in the R5, because the overheating has gotten better. But if you're in very harsh conditions and hot conditions like the Outback, the camera still tends to get quite hot and overheat eventually. The second patent application I found very interesting as well is for built-in ND filters in EOS R style cameras. In a lot of cinema cameras we already have built-in ND filters, but it would be so handy to have built-in ND filters in a camera like an EOS R5 for instance, because it would allow you to quickly change a filter in or out. Having these built into the body would be amazing, especially if you could assign like the use of the filter to a custom mode. So if I go to video custom mode 1, the camera would automatically put in my ND filter, for instance, and if I go out of it again, it might take it out again. So that would be fantastic. I've heard that Canon is definitely working on introducing some very unique features in some of the upcoming camera bodies, and that would definitely be fitting that category, wouldn't it? I know a lot of you guys always hate when the camera manufacturers put so many new video features in these cameras, but I definitely think that's where it's heading at the moment, and we will get great photo features, but definitely going forward the camera manufacturers will also focus on more and more video features in these cameras. And then there was another interesting rumor that said we will likely already see a replacement of one of the current RF lenses, and they listed a few lenses like maybe a 70-200 or 24-70 or 24-105. So there's a few interesting choices there that could be replaced. If you had to replace one RF lens yourself, which ones would it be? I know a lot of you guys would actually prefer to replace the 100-500 with a 100-500 that would actually zoom all the way back if you're using an extender. Or another interesting one could also be a 70-200mm lens that can actually take a 1.4 extender, for instance, because the current versions can't take extenders at all. For the last few weeks, there have been all these rumors about the upcoming retro Nikon, the ZF, and it looks like we finally get an announcement of that camera very soon, maybe even as soon as tomorrow or today here in Australia. So that's an interesting camera to look forward to. Also to see kind of what level of autofocus Nikon is willing to put in some of these newer cameras, because the price will be around the $2,000 mark, so not super cheap, but also not super expensive. And from what I've been reading, it seems to have some features, at least from the Z8 or Z9. I don't think it will have the same autofocus, but it seems to have things like 3D tracking, for instance, which some of these other cameras don't have. So it will be interesting to see how this camera will perform in the field. A retro camera is probably not that interesting for us wildlife photographers, but for street photographers, I think it will be quite an interesting camera, and that 24 megapixel is probably a sweet spot for that kind of style of photography as well. So all in all, it's going to be an interesting camera to look forward to. Is this some camera you might buy because you want to have a different design, kind of more of a retro feel, or do you feel like you just want to have a camera that is just suited for wildlife photography? Let me know in the comments. Also make sure to give me a thumbs up for this video. Check out my channel membership where you can support me directly for a small monthly contribution and get some cool membership perks. And of course, don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you in the next video very soon. Bye guys.